I'm going to start sharing. Hello, everybody. Good afternoon, good evening, and good morning. We'll wait a few more minutes until everyone is logged in, and then we'll get started today. Meanwhile, if you would introduce those of you who have been here before know the tradition. If you would introduce yourself in the chat so we know your name, your institution, a little bit about yourself, and what country you're in. Since it's multi-country, we have folks from different countries attending, and we'd love to know if you are currently mentoring or not. So if you would introduce yourself in the chat. Thank you, Russell, for taking the lead. Thank you. Thank you. All right. Georgia, United States, where else? Ethiopia. Not mentoring, some mentoring. Okay, great. So we have a range of people. We'll give a few more minutes. Oh, good. Some UGA representation. Excellent. EPHI. Where else? Infectious disease fellows here at Emory. Great. So I'll give you a few more minutes. More EPHI, National Center for TB and Lung Disease in Georgia. Great to have you here. Let's just wait another minute or two and then we'll get started. As you're introducing yourselves, I do want to just say and share the map of all of the different track locations, just to show the extent of how the TB Research Center is collaborating across many countries here. So it's great to see that you are all logged in from different places, of course, in the morning here, in the evening and afternoon for all of you. Some of you taking part after work hours, so thank you so much for being here. As you may know, if you've attended sessions so far, we are offering this series to strengthen TB research capacity by increasing mentorship knowledge and skills, and also building strong networks of TB researchers and mentors across international institutions and settings. Laurel, I just want to confirm we're recording. I think we are. Is it? Yes, it shows we are. Okay. So let's go ahead and get started. I know a few people might join us, but we have just about an hour together today. So our topic today is going to be communication and feedback. And as you can see from the screen, we've had, this is our fourth session in the track series. So excited to keep moving through our important topics in mentorship. So today we're talking about communication and feedback, and then we'll be talking in our next session about mentoring in diverse contexts, and then the following session, which we still are determining the date, building mentoring capacity at institutions, and we'll say more about those sessions later. So thank you for being here. Today, we're going to cover, if we have time, and I'm hoping we can get through all three of these things, the clear model of communication to help us understand how to communicate in mentorship, a framework called Open the Front Door. There's lots of different ways actually to think about communication and mentorship, but I like the acronym so that we can remind ourselves in the moment of a meeting how it is we can think about clear communication, especially in moments of tension, which is when Open the Front Door comes into play. And then some tips for positive feedback or how to have effective feedback. And some of those will be good reminders, and some of those may be new to all of you who are here today. As a reminder, really communication and feedback is at the core of mentorship. It's one of the primary mechanisms of mentorship, primary reasons for mentorship, and we can always improve. As long as we've been mentoring, there's always room for growth. So some of the areas that we can think about how to improve communication or having strong communication is, of course, guidance on research projects, as many of us are researchers and are focused particularly on research mentoring. So guidance around things like feasibility, ethics, methods, innovation, feedback on writing, right? Research proposals, grant proposals, manuscripts, feedback on presentations like scientific conferences, invited talks, as well as feedback on general career decision-making and navigating the life of being an academic, being in clinic, and being a researcher. So what I'd like to hear from you is a quick poll here. I'm curious just from you, when you're receiving feedback personally, how do you prefer your feedback? And here are some choices you can select. So how do you prefer feedback? Written comments, verbally in person, verbally on the phone, verbally Zoom or virtual platform, or it really just depends, maybe a variety of these things. So I'll let you answer that. So how do you personally prefer your feedback? Looks like so far, a lot of you choosing written comments. I think those can be really important. Also, some of you preferring perhaps verbal meetings, but virtually. That's very interesting. We are in a time where we use our virtual platforms more than ever. They can be so much more convenient and timely, and sometimes it depends. And I ask this question because there isn't always one right way to provide communication, but typically we do have a preference, as do our mentees. And so thinking and asking our mentees about their preferences can be really helpful at the beginning of the relationship. And we've talked a bit about that when we talked about aligning expectations, and I'm bringing it back up today as to being transparent and having conversations about how people prepare or prefer their feedback and their communication is really important. So keeping this in mind, let's move forward. I'm just curious from you if you are willing and able to type in the chat. And also, by the way, you may unmute and ask questions at any point in time or chat questions at any point in time. But what have you experienced are some common challenges with communication and mentorship. So even if you're not a mentor right now, you've been a supervisor or an advisor, or you've been a mentee or an advisee, what are some common challenges with communication that you have? I'll pause a minute and let you type a few things in the chat. What are some challenges you might have with communication? Awfully quiet out there in the chat this morning. Anybody have any challenges? Oh, here we go. All right. Sometimes it just takes a minute, I know, to think of ideas. Finding a compatible way to communicate, certainly. And I'm not sure if there's some specifics around that, whether that's just, sometimes we just recognize that I'm trying to say something and they're not hearing me, and we don't always know why it's a mismatch, but sometimes it just feels like a mismatch. I think the communication around meeting or using different email styles, oh gosh, understanding tone in email can be a real challenge, right? Being clear and succinct, right? That's something I've had to learn is when I have a lot of things to say, how do I pick the most important things and communicate those in a timely manner? Emails versus text versus calls. Thank you so much for adding that. Lack of focus, being all over the place, no agenda for meetings, all kind of common and typical challenges with communication. All right, so keeping those, so if you haven't typed in something in the chat, I do want you to think in your own spaces right now, in your own minds, where you have had challenges with communication in any of your relationships, what has contributed to that, and how have you made perhaps those things better? So I have a few more questions for you. So let me ask you this. Let me launch this poll for you. Hang on. Okay, here we go. This is I meaning you. Before I send a message, I think about the best way to communicate it. So this kind of speaks to this text here about email versus text or calls. Whether it should be in person, over the phone, in a newsletter, via memo, or so on, other ways. So before you send a message, how often do you really think about the best way to send it? Some say, thank you for your honesty, whoever responded with the rarely, often, very often, but some thought, it looks like from all of you in terms of how you communicate. That's 6 of 17. What about the rest of you? How do you feel about thinking about how you send a message? That's about 10 out of 17 of you have responded so far. 1 rarely, 1 sometimes, some often, some very often. It looks like you're really kind of the spread of how you think about when and how you send your message. I'll give another minute for response, but it does seem like overall, all of you are considering how is the best way to communicate information, which mechanism is best. All right, so all of you can see that. All right, so let me ask you another question. How many of you try to anticipate and predict the possible causes of confusion and deal with them up front ahead of time? Very often, lots of thought going into your communication. That's good to hear. Rarely, often, very often. Okay, great. About 8 of you have responded. Let's see what else when other people come in. Still, most of you landing on the often. You think about how it may cause confusion or what the impact of that message might be. More coming in at often, a few more at sometimes. And I really, again, I appreciate those of you who are answering honestly here, because sometimes we're very busy and we don't always know that we have to think about the impact of our communication before we send it out. Some of you more landing on sometimes. I'll give another minute to respond to the poll. Let me share the results back with you. So kind of a different continuum on how it is we think about the impact of messages, or perhaps things that might cause confusion more specifically before we send out a message or have a conversation. Okay, and then I have one more question for you. Let's launch this one. This is about you. So I'm curious about all of you here on the call. If you don't understand something, do you tend to keep this to yourself and figure it out later, or do you ask for help, right? That would be your other option. Because I think this shows that being a receiver on communication, that we have to think about being the person communicating and starting the communication, but also the person on the other end, how they might be reacting, especially in mentorship. It could be hard, right, to share when you don't understand something. So a little more on the rarely, that you keep it to yourself and try to figure out later. But some of you do seem to keep it to yourself and figure it out later. All right, so kind of a spread here of how people respond when they find themselves not understanding something about communication. Okay, so let's keep all this in mind, how we can all fall and range in a continuum when we are giving and receiving feedback. So let's move forward. And what I'd like to do next is share with you this mentoring scenario. If possible, I'd like to have you respond to a few questions about this in the chat. And if that is difficult for you to do, depending on where you are right now, I'll move forward and talk through it with the CLEAR model, which we'll get to. So in this mentoring scenario, and you can read along with me, Dr. Rashid is working very hard on his research proposal. He has written a complete draft of the proposal, but has not shared it with his mentors yet. So that's really important. So he has this work done. He's concerned that it isn't good enough quality to meet program standards. This is his first time writing a research proposal in the required format for his program. During his meeting with his mentoring team, they asked Dr. Rashid why he has not shared his proposal by the predetermined deadline. Dr. Rashid says that it isn't finished and he has several things to work on before sending it to the mentoring team. His primary mentor tells Dr. Rashid that he must send it by the end of the week if he wants feedback with enough time to stay on track with the project. The primary mentor wonders why the secondary mentor and Dr. Rashid are so quiet in their mentoring meetings. The primary mentor is anxious because he's leaving town for a conference and then a vacation, and he is worried he won't have time to provide thorough feedback. He really believes in, this should be Dr. Rashid here, that's a typo, work and wants him to succeed. He doesn't know the secondary mentor very well, but is happy that he's part of the team. The secondary mentor has extensive background in the methodology that Dr. Rashid is using for his project, but he's still a junior scientist. So what I'd like you to do is I'm going to actually put some discussion questions in the chat, and I'd like to hear what you have to say, and I'll pull up that scenario again in a minute. So what is going on in this scenario, first of all? Given this scenario, where are there challenges with communication? And specifically, perhaps where are there challenges with the primary mentor, secondary mentor, or perhaps the mentee? So I'm going to stop sharing for a minute just so I can get to the chat. And I'm going to put these discussion questions in the chat. So I hope you're all thinking as I'm doing this. Okay, and let me get back to my slides. Okay, so here is your scenario. You have the discussion questions in the chat. What do you think? I'd love to hear from you. Where, reading this scenario, between this is a mentoring team, right? Where do you see that perhaps there's some breakdown in communication or some challenges with communication? You're welcome to unmute and share, or you could share in the chat. What do people think? There seems to be no continuum of active discussion along the process. Yeah, there's kind of some directives in here, perhaps, but not really a discussion about what's going on, right? Maybe there was a lack of communication about expectations early in the relationship or around the research proposal, especially if this is Dr. Rashid's first time doing it in this kind of certain requirement. Maybe there needed to be more expectations or guidance before it was actually submitted. Absolutely. Any other thoughts? Yeah, great point, Jared. Lack of communication between mentors. There seems to be this silence in this meeting that's happening, right? While it's being directed by the primary mentor. And so that usually cues us into the fact that maybe something else is going on, right? Maybe there are some undercurrents, or people might be afraid to share how they're feeling or progress on their work. Maybe even the secondary mentor is hesitant to speak up for some reason. We don't really know why. There might be a lack of comfort, absolutely, Russell, in this mentee speaking up in this mentoring team. It can be intimidating as a mentee, not only just having one mentor, but also having two in the meetings. And again, this work is done, right? But he hasn't communicated that his work is done. He just hasn't submitted it. And so the mentors aren't aware of the status or what's going on, right? Okay, so let's move forward and think about how we might address some of these communication challenges given the clear model of communication. Please, by the way, continue to type ideas in the chat as I move forward. So the clear model for communication is an acronym, so it has 5 parts to it, and it's really helpful to guide communication between mentors and mentees throughout mentorship, but particularly when you're thinking about having meetings individually or with teams. So I'm going to share this model, which kind of is some general guidance on communication. And then I'm going to share a specific model for when moments get tense, how we might address those moments, all right? I will say this model has different versions. It's used in coaching, education, therapy, and counseling. So I will share with you this one particularly, which is connect, learn, explore, action, review. And then sometimes the letters are used a little bit differently, but the main premise is the same, is that we're intentional about how we clearly communicate. So the connect, often sometimes called being centered in your communication, emphasizes the importance of building a strong and positive relationship between the mentor and mentee by establishing trust and rapport. It means taking time to get to know each other, sharing backgrounds, interests, and goals, being clear about who we are. And this includes, of course, active listening, empathy, and really demonstrating a genuine interest in each other. So let's return to this scenario we just discussed, where we could have, instead of kind of this silence that's happening in this meeting around the mentee and their deliverables and maybe some directives from the primary mentor, perhaps if this meeting was started with some more casual and friendly conversation that allowed us to check in with each other and really just ask the mentee how they're doing, to maybe learn a little bit about the context of their work. And the secondary mentor could also chime in here by leading by example, by sharing something about their own research, mentioning something about their own research lab, something to set the tone that there is space to know each other beyond just this product of deliverable of a research proposal. And then perhaps the mentee could be brave and share something about their own life, career status, or something that's happened to them. And if you're mentoring across countries or across culture, which many of us are here in these projects for the track, you might want to share something that's going on in your own country just to familiarize each other with how you are working or the context of your working environment. The next step in CLEAR is learn or listen. This focuses on understanding the mentee's needs, goals, and challenges by gathering information and insight into what the mentee hopes to achieve. The key here is asking open-ended questions, which is a really important tool in communication, then probing for details and actively seeking to understand. And what I like to say here is this is listening for listening's sake, not listening to respond, but truly listening just to understand what's going on and encouraging the mentee to share as much as possible. And so in this scenario that we just talked about with Dr. Rashid and his mentors, again, starting with some open-ended questions about their personal life or this how they're doing overall, but then moving into open-ended questions about their work in general. So what progress have you made rather than did you finish your proposal or why didn't you send it in? What progress did you make? What parts have you completed? Where are you getting stuck? What parts do you need help on today? When would you like to complete the proposal? What's most important for you to accomplish? So again, these questions that allow us to learn more about the scenario before jumping to creating a new timeline for deliverables. And of course, part of active listening is reflecting back to the mentee what you hear, especially again, when you're working across culture, kind of summarizing what you hear back for clarification and allowing time for clarification is really important. In that time, mentors sharing empathy and active listening, and mentees, of course, do have a responsibility to speak up and share their own aspirations and goals as well. The next letter in the CLEAR model is E for explore. So once there's been some listening and learning, together, mentors and mentees can jointly explore potential strategies and solutions and actions to help the mentee achieve goals. This involves brainstorming, problem solving, and discussing various approaches, hopefully without judgment. So before determining if an idea is good or bad, this is an opportunity just to get a lot of ideas on the table with some honest dialogue, both from the mentors and the mentees. So in this scenario, for example, the mentors, especially the primary mentor, even might refrain from judgment while they're exploring ideas on how to move forward with the mentee, with Dr. Rashid. So perhaps the primary mentor would ask them, more about what do you want for this timeline in this project? Of course, keeping in mind what needs to be done for the program and meeting certain external deadlines as well. One thing might be suggesting or exploring breaking the research proposal into smaller pieces, reviewing it smaller chunks at a time. And again, the secondary mentor could also chime in here and really suggest ways to move forward. One thing might be if the secondary mentor is feeling shy in the team meetings, the secondary mentor could offer to meet one-on-one with the mentee. Perhaps that would be a more effective way to share some wisdom and knowledge, specifically in this situation where we know the secondary mentor has expertise and methods that could be helpful, right? And then a mentee should also be suggesting some ideas so that it is a true exploration across the mentoring team of how to fix or move forward with this research project. After that kind of connection, after learning from each other and exploring what's going on, then it's time to move into this action phase, right? And again, this allows us to acknowledge what's going on and then what needs to happen next. So here we shift into making specific goals, developing action plans, setting new expectation, really defining what needs to come next. And what's critical in this action stage is that the mentors continue to provide and identify how they can offer support to the mentees. So in this scenario, the mentors, again, would help establish a mutually agreed upon revised timeline, or maybe it's not a timeline, maybe it's even just support for their next steps, or just getting the mentee to submit what they have already for review. So some sort of actions at this point determined by the mentors and the mentee are critical. And as a reminder, mentors, in order to show support and to help move action forward, might be able to share their own examples of previous research proposals, their own examples of how they've moved from a place of feeling stagnant into action, so that a mentee knows they're not alone in these kind of processes of perhaps having delays or hesitancy, and that there are ways, multiple ways to take action to move the research forward. And the last step in CLEAR is review, or ongoing response is another way to look at it. So you can review your actual meeting and your discussion that you have, but also to emphasize to the mentee that we will have ongoing review of your work. And so please know that you can send us what you have, and it won't be the first or last time we look at your work. There's many opportunities for growth, right? So the review part of the CLEAR model really emphasizes ongoing review and feedback, discussing what's working well, identifying areas for improvement and adjustment, and really this thought of kind of constructive feedback in this meeting particularly, but also throughout the mentorship. So I'm going to pause for a moment and just ask if there are any questions. Let me get to this last slide. Yep. So I think I mentioned this. So the review and response in this mentoring scenario might look like the mentors leaving time at the end of the meeting to say, what did go well in our meeting today? Did we cover everything? What have we missed? And do note that oftentimes we can't cover everything in our meetings. And so part of staying online or kind of communicating and making sure we all have that feedback about what worked is also perhaps keeping a list of what we need to do next time. That can be really helpful. Also, as mentors, we can communicate what's a priority right now in this meeting, and also communicate through a list of what we can do later that may not be as important at this moment, right? And again, mentors sharing and communicating their own experience along the way is really important, and recognizing success is also really critical. So communicating back what they're doing well as what needs to be improved. All right, so now I will pause and ask if you have any questions about the CLEAR model. Please feel free to unmute or chat any questions you have about using this model. Okay. Oops, not going to do that. Let me see. Okay, I'm going to stop for a moment and let you see if you have any questions, and then I'm going to share my slides again.
Dawn, I have one question.
Yeah.
I've been in scenarios before, maybe multi-mentor type settings, multiple mentors for one mentee, where occasionally maybe one mentor has a tendency to sort of take over the meeting, just kind of cannibalize, and everybody has a hard time sort of redirecting. Just curious at any thoughts or strategies about mentor or the other mentors or mentees, just sort of how to maybe corral that person or kind of redirect the meeting in a positive fashion.
Yes, I think that is a pretty common scenario. And I think so this next open the front door I'm going to show you will be helpful a little. I actually give an example that is similar to that. So that will help. I think one way to do that, and I think we underutilize this tool of mentors reaching out to each other. So I think if you are the secondary mentor, I'm calling it the secondary mentor. You may not be secondary. You might be supposed to be, equal. I think reaching out to each other, like hopping on Zoom a few minutes before, staying on Zoom a few minutes together after, and saying, I'd really like to contribute. How can I add more? What role do you want me to play? I know you have these expertise. This is what I think I can bring. But sometimes I think that conversation needs to happen outside of the meeting with the mentee. And I don't think I see that happening enough. That's what I would suggest. Let me get through to this next example and see if this is also helpful, because it kind of addresses this scenario of, particularly in this case, the secondary mentor not saying too much in the meeting, and how perhaps this could change based on using this model. That's a great question, and I think an ongoing consideration for our mentoring teams. And that's just 2 mentors. Oftentimes we could have even more than that, in which case it might be difficult to have all your opinion, or your opinions might be different. And sometimes that's a challenging thing to resolve when you're all in a meeting together trying to give direction to a mentee. So I want to bring forward this model of open the front door. I think most of the times things go well, but sometimes when things aren't going well, it's hard to know how to speak up and say something. And this model is actually used in a lot of teaching and in education to kind of make course corrections in the middle of a conversation where there's been microaggressions or implicit bias that has gone unrecognized, or there's just a moment where perhaps people are feeling a bit off-put or even hurt. And sometimes it helps us to have kind of these plan in place on how we address these somewhat more difficult or challenging conversations. And Meseret, I see your question. I'm going to get to it in a minute. So I've provided some resources here, but I wanted to talk through some of this open the front door, which I think is a kind of an easier method to remember. How do I slow down when I'm in a conversation that doesn't feel good and I feel like I need to address it, especially if I'm feeling like I'm not the person who's necessarily in charge or the most powerful in the room? So open the front door framework is a useful tool for affirming positive behavior, redressing problematic behavior, and evoking growth in respectful and expansive ways. And again, the previous slide cites the resources that this comes from. So please go and take a look at that website and those resources if you want additional explanation. When conflict arises, ignoring and avoiding it usually is not the best option. I mean, there are times we need to take a break and calm down, but this method of observe, think, feel, and what we desire can help us take this situation and perhaps move it forward into a more positive place, while also recognizing something that's occurred. All right. And it allows us to kind of redirect and frame perhaps moments of bias, disagreement, or even hostility or discomfort. So observe in this acronym means you state in clear, unambiguous language what you see happening. Then you reflect and state what you think. So you express what you think or what you imagine others might be thinking. You feel, you express your feelings about the situation, and then you state your desire, what you would like to happen after that. So let's return to the example of the scenario we just discussed, where we have a mentee who's completed their work but has not felt comfortable sharing it. And we have a primary mentor who's wondering what's going on, but still being quite directive about what it is the mentee needs to do without really asking what's going on, right? And we have a secondary mentor who has a lot of expertise, but is quiet during the meetings, and we don't really know why, right? So let's take this position of the secondary mentor for a minute and see how, perhaps if you are in a conversation and you're not sure how to approach what's going on, but you know something needs to shift and be addressed, how you could use Open the Front Door to do that. And really, if you are this person, and I think this about my work a lot, how can you advocate for a mentee when you have a sense that perhaps they're being shy about sharing what's going on, probably out of respect for the mentor, or just uncertainty, or a feeling like they perhaps aren't good enough to speak up, or their work isn't good enough? And I think this is a moment where we could really think about building relationships rather than remaining silent, and really then role modeling as mentors back to mentees how we can have some challenging conversations. So I use a pretty straightforward example as a practice scenario for this method. But again, you can use this in moments of much higher tension to really address something that's going on in a mentoring meeting or other relationships. So using the example from the earlier mentoring scenario, again, focusing on perhaps the secondary mentor taking initiative to speak up, using the Open the Front Door approach could move them into more discussion about how they can support Dr. Rashid, right? So first, the secondary mentor could observe and state this. I noticed that Dr. Rashid wasn't able to share details about his research proposal process or what obstacles might be making it difficult to finish the proposal, right? So just simply stating what you're noticing going on. Then sharing what you think is happening. I think mentees feel pressure to impress the mentors when they're in the process of getting to know each other, and mentees might be concerned about letting mentors down, right? So this secondary mentor has this opportunity just to kind of share what they think might be happening in this mentorship, right? Without really any judgment, but just something that might be common and important to bring to the forefront. So, and then they share, I know I felt this way as a mentee, always helpful. Then they discuss how they feel about the next steps. I feel it's important to talk through setbacks since we all have them and we need to learn from our mistakes. I would really like Dr. Rashid to feel comfortable sharing more about what's going on with his work. And then the desire, let's stop for a moment and hear about Dr. Rashid's process and how we can support him. Dr. Rashid, can you say more about what parts of your proposal are completed and what has been difficult, right? So I think that using something like this sometimes takes practice, but even just having this acronym in our head might give us some confidence when we are the ones who might be hesitant to speak up, to really just slow down and maybe course correct and find out more about what's going on in a mentoring situation in an effort to support a mentee in a way that's helpful for them. So I'm going to pause and just say, what comments do you have, or what are your thoughts or questions about using this type of method when perhaps it might be harder to speak up, or there might be a need to address something in a more sensitive or a situation that has more tension? I'm going to, while you're thinking, pause and read Meseret's question in the chat. As a mentee, how do we balance to meet the mentor's expectations and our level of understanding of the subject matter? How much can we be vulnerable and opening up and sharing the material or idea? That's a bit of a hard question to answer, because it's a bit of a, it depends, I think. I think that, trust and rapport is built over time. And part of what builds that is being really thoughtful about communication. There's another model of communication that really talks through preparing for these conversations. And I think we can be really busy people, and we tend to lean on our dominant communication style. But if we are recognizing that mentorship isn't one size fits all. We do need to stop and adapt to our individual mentees and their own style and preference for feedback and communication. At the end of this presentation, I actually link a couple of free assessment tools. We in our programs have paid to do things like the DISC. They can be quite expensive, or other communication assessments, but there are also many free kind of working style and communication assessments out there that allow us to self-reflect. So I've added a few of those at the end of the slides. But I think, Meseret, the answer is really, it depends. You know, sometimes we have to, we do need to take risks of some vulnerability, but sometimes we need to also be thoughtful about when we're vulnerable, because our mentors could be in positions that are really important and powerful. I think one more thing I might say about that is, sometimes what helps with communication or when there's vulnerability is to state the vulnerability. So to start by saying, I'm unsure if this is something I should bring to this meeting, or I feel a bit uncomfortable bringing this to this meeting, but I'm going to take a risk. So I think sometimes communicating beforehand what you're about to do establishes with the mentors that, hey, you are uncertain about this, so keep that in mind as you're sharing it, right? So I think sometimes the context before or the feelings around what we're sharing are as important as the actual sharing. So I would keep that in mind as a strategy. Any other questions? Okay, so again, the sources for this are linked and the websites that this example is mine, but the previous slides come from the sources on the previous slides. So they're taken again from kind of how to have or address tense moments in the classroom, but also are utilizable when we're in small team meetings and group meetings. So there are PDFs and handouts on it in those PowerPoints if you would like more information, and thank you to those folks who put this out there and available for all of us to use. So the next thing I want to talk in the time we have left is that's kind of communication in general. We discussed is more on specifically as mentors, how we might give feedback. And really, truly, mentees are giving feedback to mentors too. It just looks a little different. So this is these next few slides are a little bit more concrete about the actual delivery of feedback, not just general communication. There's lots of different types of feedback. So one thing to start with as mentors is to think through, what kind of feedback are we giving? Constructive feedback, timely feedback, balanced feedback, regular check-ins or goal-oriented feedback. So of course, constructive feedback, focusing on how things can improve. Timely feedback, thinking about how we give feedback at the right time to really optimize action on it. Balanced feedback, thinking about how we're giving positive feedback and citing accomplishments as well as room for improvement. Regular check-ins, of course, we advocate for this. This is critical in mentorship, so that feedback doesn't happen all at once. It happens at the right time over time. And then goal-oriented feedback, really thinking about what do we want as the outcomes, right, from this feedback that we're giving. So feedback is more likely to be used when it's mutual, actionable, descriptive, specific, and well-timed. I know many of these things are used in your clinical responsibilities as well as your mentorship. So let's move forward and talk about mutual feedback, and let's see how well you know what it means to give mutual feedback. Here's a little quiz. You could put your answer in the chat. So when we're thinking about developing and designing and coming up with mutual feedback, which example below shows mutual feedback? A, the mentor says, send me your PowerPoint slides tonight and I'll send you comments about what needs to be fixed. Or B, the mentor says, tell me about how you would like my feedback. Would you like me to meet with you and go over the slides, or send me feedback over email? Which one, A or B, is mutual feedback? You can put it in the chat since I don't have it up in the poll. A or B? That's right. Smart group of people. Yes, the mentor is asking for feedback. It's a mutual decision. How would you like me to go over the slides? When would you like me to go over the slides? And how would you prefer that feedback? Okay. By the way, I am going to stop and do a quick poll I meant to do earlier, but I am curious about this, if I can get it. Okay, let's see. I am curious from you in the room, just when you are communicating and when you're giving feedback, do you feel you're a better listener or a better talker? All right. Wow. Big group of listeners. Okay. Anybody feel they're a better talker? I'll just say I would probably say I'm a better talker. I'm always working on my listening skills. All right, so I'm not alone. Thank you for those out in the room. So yeah, I think sometimes this is helpful when we're communicating and we're giving feedback. I really try to be mindful of my tendency to like to talk. And so I really do have to pull back and listen. And so when we are giving feedback, just kind of knowing yourself is important. So mostly listeners in this room and a few talkers, but being mindful of that in ourselves and in our trainees can be really helpful. All right. Feedback is also more likely to be used when it's actionable. So tell me in the example below, what is actionable feedback? A, please revise your discussion section to include how your results fit within the context of TB studies mentioned in your literature review. Or B, your discussion section is okay. By the way, that is a comment I have seen. Which one do you think is best? Yes, absolutely. A is a bit obviously a better suggestion. You need to know that when you write something down, a mentee needs to be able to take it and act on it specifically, right? And this really does take more time and consideration, but it also saves you time in the long run because you're giving them enough information to actually do what you're asking them to do. Okay, next, descriptive and specific, which I think really aligns with being actionable. Descriptive and specific feedback, here is an example. It takes a little bit more time, it tends to be a little bit longer, but again, you're more likely to have a response from your mentee that is along the lines with what you request. So here's another one. Your literature review captures the most important findings from TB research over the past 5 years. Very specific feedback on what was done well. You synthesize the findings in a way that makes it easy for the reader to understand. Great encouragement, right? Now, please include additional studies that are relevant to your methodology. For example, I would include Smith et al., Flounders and Chasm, and Brilliante et al. So then very specific, very actionable, and also descriptive about what's done well and what needs to improve. Again, not all of your comments need to be this level of detail, but where you do see something that needs to be revised on a manuscript, a presentation, it's really helpful to share what's done well, specifically, not just great job. Tell them what was done well as what could be improved. It's more time consuming, but it's more likely to be used by the mentee. The last one is being well-timed. I want y'all just to pause right now and think about a time where you heard news and it was just really bad timing. Maybe you're having a bad day, maybe you were stuck in traffic, but really the importance and the skill of thinking about how to time feedback the best we can. Now, we don't know everything going on in our mentors and mentees' lives, so we can't always do it perfectly, but do consider how it is you can provide feedback in a way that is well-timed. First of all, most importantly in mentorship, hopefully when you've used your IDPs and your mentor-mentee agreement, you've already established guidelines for response time. So as mentors, you've said, I need at least a week or 2 weeks to provide you comments on a written document or a presentation. Hopefully the mentee also knows if you send me comments, I will try to get it back to you within a reasonable time frame. So this is a mutual expectation here that the mentees also respond on time as well as the mentors responding within a reasonable time. And that is all clear and transparent from the beginning of your relationship. But also sometimes considering our larger external factors, Are we providing feedback at the end of the semester when someone's on clinical rotations and unable to respond? Are there other major grant deadlines coming up at a time where they just cannot absorb feedback, particularly if it's highly critical? Has the mentee had recent rejection from a peer-reviewed journal or a funding agency? Maybe this isn't the time they need additional feedback. Unless it's positive, maybe that's a good time for feedback. And also, just as a reminder that mentorship is about our academic, our research, and clinical lives, but also thinking about who we are as whole human beings. So are they out because of COVID? Have they had recent illness for themselves or their family? Or, are they out on their wedding or honeymoon and really just unable to focus on their work and perhaps don't need to be reminded of their work responsibilities when they're trying to escape and have time away? So just thinking through how it is you can be well-timed in your feedback. Of course, some other good guidelines for feedback. They're not likely to be used if it's too much feedback or too negative. I mentioned that earlier, kind of balancing your feedback. Trying not to attack a character like you're a sloppy writer. Instead, say, what it is that needs to be done in that writing to make it more concise or more scientific. We've discussed already in all of our series that mentoring is not one size fits all. So again, do take time at the beginning of your relationships to understand more about what works for each specific mentee. With that, I will just share with you some free personality and communication tools. I think it is really helpful to understand your own communication style, and you can use these with your mentees and discuss them as part of your mentorship. We'll send these out in the slides so that you should have these links. And actually, I'll stop in a minute and I can put the live links in the chat too. And then we also, Laurel, if you want to throw up the evaluation survey, we do love to hear your feedback on each session. So if you would take a few minutes to fill out that evaluation link so we know what you liked and what else we can cover for topics. And remember, our next session, we're talking about mentoring in diverse contexts. So building on what we've done so far, we'll talk a bit more about managing mentoring teams. Some great questions came up today. I also am going to share some strategies for peer mentoring, because sometimes we just don't have access to people who are more senior to mentor us, and sometimes peer mentoring is essential to your success. I'll also talk a little bit about accountability partners and pods, which we don't talk too much about, but are great ways to have supplemental support in addition to our primary mentoring relationships. So with that, I'm gonna stop sharing for a minute and take questions. What questions do you have, as we have a few more minutes left in our session today, and I'm going to put these links in the chat for you. Please feel free to unmute or ask questions in the chat. What questions do you have about communication and feedback? And I'm also, thank you, Laurel, for putting the evaluation survey. I don't know if those links are going to come through. So let me actually add the live links to those communication style assessments. What questions do you have about feedback? Anybody? Not letting me, okay, I'm struggling. Okay, so we will send you the live links to those communication surveys when we send out the slides and the evaluation survey after the meeting today. So please, if you're looking for that opportunity to learn more about yourselves and your mentees and use those in your mentoring relationships, again, you just have to, they take about 5 minutes to finish and they'll send you results in your email. And otherwise, I know that often our meetings, we are not thinking deliberately about a model when we're communicating, but even hearing these methods and thinking about how we might use some different tools or prepare for our conversations can help you be more efficient and successful in your mentorship, and also perhaps avert some disagreements or confusion. And with that, I think we are done for today. So I'll stay on for another minute or two if you have questions. Otherwise, thank you so much for being here this morning, this afternoon, or this evening, wherever you are. And we hope you'll join us for our next session. I really like talking about the teams and the pods and accountability partners, because some of that is really new to how we're thinking about supporting research trainees and faculty. So please join us for the next session.